Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this brisk fall day. My name is Trina Shanks. I'm Director of Community Engagement and a professor here at School of Social Work. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a person wearing glasses. I have short curly hair, a green dress, and a scarf. If you want captions, hit CC for closed captioning or show subtitle at the bottom, and you'll be able to activate captions. And in the upper right-hand side, you can toggle between gallery or speaker view. So you could either see just the PowerPoint slider who's talking or everyone. I'm really excited about our session today. We'll be exploring fines and fees levied by courts and law enforcement and its disproportionate impact on communities of color and how they exacerbate economic and race-based disparities. So we have wonderful speakers. And so we'll be introduced to all of them in just a second. I want to remind students who are part of the Engaged Community mini course to please remember to stay on for a debrief immediately after the official session ends. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to give a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Engage is very aware that we function in a society that has a deep history of exploitation, stealing both land and labor that has affected and shaped our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. We are committed to acknowledging this in everything we do and work to create a more inclusive tomorrow. So I'd like each of us to take a few minutes just to read our land and labor acknowledgement. Thanks so much. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce our Engaged team. So we have Sonia Harb, who's our Detroit engagement strategist. We have Aisha Ghazi Edwin, who is a Engaged program manager, adjunct lecturer, and helps organize this lecture series. And then Fatima Salman, who is our Engaged program manager. So thank you to all the members of the Engaged team that makes this happen. And with that, I will hand it over to Aisha to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. Thank you so much for joining us. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I'm a person with short black hair, and I'm wearing a black polka dot shirt and a cardigan. That's just something that we do for accessibility purposes. So it shows up in the transcript. So to all participants, this is meant to be an interactive session. We really want you guys to jump in, chat if you have a question, and we will unmute you. And as Dr. Shanks described, this is a special session exploring fines and fees levied by courts and law enforcement and its disproportionate impact on people of color and those who are low income. And again, as a reminder to students and panelists, students of the Engaged Community mini course, please stay on afterward briefly for a short debrief. So before we get started, I'd like to allow my co-host of this session, co-facilitator, Nicholas Buckingham, to have a few minutes to introduce himself. And Nicholas, there's some prompts on the slide that I'm going to go to next to help you out. So just name, pronoun, and the rest of it.
Cool. Thank you for that, Aisha. Hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas Tefel Buckingham. I use the pronouns he, him. I am the person that is wearing a yellow shirt with a gray picture in the middle of it. And I am currently the co-founder and campaign director for Michigan Liberation, which is a statewide nonprofit organization that focuses on the leadership development of formerly incarcerated folks and also creating campaigns to challenge and eliminate a lot of the policies, draconic policies within our criminal legal system. I'm also a student here at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, completing my master's in social work with a focus on community change. And I pass it back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. So I am now going to allow, well, first I want to introduce our other amazing guests. So we have Victoria Burton-Harris, Washtenaw County Chief Assistant Prosecutor, Ellie Savit, who's a Washtenaw County Prosecutor, Dr. Meghan O Neil, Research Investigator at the Population Studies Center. I want to give you each a few minutes to also introduce yourselves, and let me bring up that slide again to help guide you. Victoria, why don't you go ahead?
Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Burton-Harris. As you heard, I am the Chief Assistant Prosecutor for Washtenaw County. My pronouns are she, her. My identifiers this morning, I am a Black woman with short Black hair, red glasses, gray sweater, red lipstick. And the work that I do, I think it's twofold if I get to boil it down. We as prosecutors respond to situations and try to, while balancing community safety with accountability, look to really get to the real reason why someone came into the system, and look to send them back out with the least restrictive means, again, while prioritizing public safety and accountability and healing. And when we're not responding to things, we are actively creating programs, ways to prevent people from coming into the system altogether, actively building relationships with people in the community, because that's where real healing takes place, not in the criminal legal system. And we are actively working to put ourselves out of business and shrink the footprint of the prosecutor by giving the people in the community more power, more resources and tools to match the solutions that they already have.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I love that you said putting ourselves out of business. That's great. Okay, next up, Washtenaw County Prosecutor Ellie Savit. Would you like to go ahead?
Absolutely, sure. So my name is Ellie Savit. I use he, him pronouns. Today, I'm a person with short, dark hair. I'm wearing a blue and white striped vertical shirt and a gray suit jacket on top of that. Victoria really emphasized the work that we do as prosecutors, and of course, you know, Victoria and I we like to call ourselves partners in justice. We work together in the prosecutor's office. So the only thing I will add on top of that, really related to today's focus, is that, you know, Victoria mentioned accountability and that we try to ensure that people, you know, if they do something, that we impose the least restrictive conditions that are necessary to ensure public safety. But the other thing that's really important to us is that whatever happens, whatever accountability has to be taken, it should be because of what you did, not because of who you are. And so frequently in the criminal system, the fines and fees that are attached to that, we are punishing and enacting disproportionate punishment on people of lower socioeconomic status that can really cascade outwards. And not just that, can really make it difficult for people to move on with their lives. So I know we'll be exploring these issues in greater detail, but just wanted to add that on top of everything that I, of course, co-signed that Victoria said.
Thank you, Ellie. I think I just lost internet access. So I'm going to try to reconnect, but Dr. Meghan O Neil, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Aisha. Hi, I'm Meghan O Neil. I use she, her pronouns. I am a female with dark brown hair and a blue necklace, black dress, and black vest. Really happy to be here. I'm a research investigator at the University of Michigan. I previously was with Michigan Law School, and I've been at the Institute for Social Research now for about 4 years. My research is federally funded, looking into the social determinants of health, and I'm particularly interested in vulnerable populations, racial inequalities, and economic inequalities. My present study is randomly assigning free legal services to people in addiction treatment centers in Southeast Michigan, particularly vulnerable folks who do not have health insurance or are covered under Medicaid. And so we're trying to understand the retrospective life histories of where people came from, how they got to where they are today, what their life looks like, and what services they might need to move on into the future and reintegrate society so that they can continue their recovery process. So I'm also a person whose I have family members who use drugs and family members who've been incarcerated and have lost family members through the system and through drug and alcohol overdose. So very passionate about this work and really happy to be here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone can now see the presentation. Okay, great. And if that happens again, we're just going to have to wing it. So I think that we have an awesome panel of guests. I know we do, especially, you know, Victoria and Ellie, I think you both bring in kind of that local understanding and also what's happening nationally at the state. And Meghan, you're doing some research here around it. And then Nick, you're actually in the field helping people around this and have experience yourself. So before we get started, I want to just kind of ground us in what do we mean by fines and fees. So as you all know, there are many different types of inequitable and harmful fines and fees, from, you know, interest that we put on bills to property taxes to payday loans. But for the purpose of this session, we're going to talk about fines and fees defined as anything you get through the criminal legal system. So that might be parking tickets, speeding tickets, bail, other sorts of predatory fees. We may also kind of talk about forfeiture here, or when the police seize property that's believed to be connected to a crime. I want to start off by saying this topic had a lot of research. Like if I wanted to, I could present all day on this, but that's not why we're here, right? We have some panelists with amazing experience. That being said, I will share some resources in the chat as we move along. And it also begs the question, you know, if so many people are studying this, why haven't we been able to solve this issue? So I want to also just kind of start off by laying down some facts. So currently there are 1.5 million people, including juveniles in the US, who are incarcerated. And, you know, Ellie, Victoria, Meghan, if you all have some more stats on this and want to jump in, please feel free. There was a study conducted by Cornell University that stated that 1 in 2 adults have an immediate family member incarcerated for at least one night. In addition, most of the people who go through the court system at every stage of the criminal legal system receive crushing fines and fees. And if they can't pay them, then they receive interest in the form of, you know, some people call it the poverty penalty. Half of families with convicted family members who are incarcerated cannot afford to pay the fees. And nearly 2 in 3 families who had a family member incarcerated were just unable to meet even the cost of basic household needs, such as food and housing. But unfortunately, you know, cities, states, courts, they do this because they want to generate revenue for the court system. And it seems like the biggest offender of this are cities, which we can talk more about. Meghan, I know some of your research is focused on this. And also Ellie and Victoria, I'd love to hear what you all know about this as well. But essentially, the average person who exits the criminal legal system has $13,607 in fines and fees. So obviously that's harmful to reentering society. Is there any information that either of you can add, Ellie, Victoria, Meghan, to some of this and how you've seen it impact people, or what you've seen locally or at a national level?
Sure. Washtenaw County is unique in many aspects because of the resources available. The 2 universities situated here, folks are doing the research. You know, it's on the surface regarded as a pretty progressive community. And I argue that I think it's penetrating a little bit deeper. The folks that we see in office, from our county prosecutor like Ellie, our county sheriff, our Board of Commissioners is becoming just more and more progressive over the years. And we're really starting to see the words that we hear from people's mouths and the beliefs show up in policies. But that still does not separate us from a lot of jurisdictions across the country It does not separate us out from jurisdictions that, when surveyed across the country, over 80% of folks give up basic needs to pay fines and fees. 38% of folks surveyed across the country throughout jurisdictions admitted to committing new crimes just to pay the fines and fees.
Wow.
What that means is that you have folks who have come into contact with the system, been assessed a fine or a fee, have been told you will go to jail if you don't pay this. And so you have them making the choice of going to jail because they're unable to pay it, or doing something, engaging in an act that will allow them to get this money, but that act is criminalized. So they're therefore committing new crimes just to get the money to turn around and pay the fines and fees that they're owed so that they don't go to jail, hoping that they don't get caught committing the new crime. And if they do, then they're kind of like just kicking the can down the road on whatever fines and fees will be assessed for that. That's what fines and fees do. Fines are punitive. That's another thing people don't really, I think, understand when they say, no, fines and fees are necessary. Fines are not. Fines are punitive. And they are, in theory, designed to keep you from doing something. How many of us have gotten parking tickets or speeding tickets and then we get them again and again and again and again? It's not like stopping us from engaging in whatever the behavior is that they're trying to punish us for and deter us from engaging in again. And in fact, what they're really turning out to be is just an attack on marginalized poor people that oftentimes are people of color, most often, in fact. And the fees that we see that do go to support, the operation of our courts and system in general, we are finding that a lot of those fees, quite frankly, are not being collected. And you see a lot of institutions spending a lot of money going after folks trying to collect the fees that they never get. And we're spending more money to go after money we don't ever get. And yet we still operate just fine. The courthouse doors have not closed permanently. So that says that you don't need to overtax and overburden poor folk to keep your courthouses running, because you're not getting it from them anyway, and yet you're still up and running.
Totally.
I'd like to add something.
Go ahead, Meghan.
Thanks, Victoria. That was great. I conducted a research study in Michigan with some colleagues throughout the country, where we created and disseminated in-depth interviews with people who were under state supervision, probation and parole, or federal supervision. And we also spoke to family members of people who were under supervision. And what we found is excessive fines and fees, like we're discussing here, and the inability to pay, and that pressure that Victoria was talking about to go out and engage in some sort of activity, any activity, simply to come up with the money is sort of a desperation. And what we are finding is there is a very grave disproportionate burden upon family members, particularly women of color, mothers, grandmothers, partners, to pay these fines and fees, sisters, to come up with the money in households that are already economically disadvantaged. And so this was a big concern, and this is something we're going to be publishing on in the future. But what we're finding is just like Victoria said, the costs of collection from the state or federal government, and the federal government, in my professional opinion, does a little bit better about assessing through pretrial services and different services, because they're better funded, assessing who can and cannot pay. And they often, at least in the Southeast District, will reduce or cancel fines and fees because they know they have a generally indigent population who cannot pay, and it's not worth their cost to try to collect the funding. But often the local governments, the municipalities we see, for instance, like Ypsilanti Township, their criminal justice system relies heavily on fines and fees. And so there is a huge pressure to collect those monies, even from folks who don't have the money, and particularly disproportionately families of color. So that actually parlays into the next slide, which is mine. I'm happy to take that, Aisha, if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it.
I worked with Ypsi Township. The folks over there are great who work in their justice system. I worked with the former judge over there and their probation department to actually collect everyone who was under probation for a whole year. And based upon our national study, we were specifically pulling records from probation in 2014. And essentially what we found is that people of color disproportionately create the probationers in Ypsilanti relative to the proportion of citizens in Ypsilanti Township. We have more particularly African-American folks under supervision, which shouldn't be a shocker to people in this meeting because we know about the disproportionate harmful systemic inequalities we have in our justice system. But even, you know, kind of shockingly, once you get down to the pie chart on the bottom, it's orange and blue, we find that this disproportionate number of folks who are Black who are paying these fees are paying for the functionality of the justice system, essentially paying almost $300,000 in fines and fees, representing 56% and over percentage of the actual population that they represent in the county, in that township rather. And so white probationers are both a smaller portion of people under supervision, and they're paying fewer fines and fees on average throughout their supervision. So this is, you know, really troubling, and we are conducting a national study that's funded by Arnold Ventures, and so all this information will be published. But you know, we really appreciate the support of Ypsi Township coming together with us. And one of the things that occurred, because we don't know theoretically why, besides, you know, of course there could be racist practices, there could be institutional issues with ability to take payments if someone, for instance, doesn't have a bank account. And then we have all these systemic injustices about, you know, racial disparities, about how people run their households, and just, you know, assuming someone has a credit card or a check that they can pay, and maybe they don't. And then we see things like fines and fees added on for non-payment or not having a timely payment. And so that could be some of the disparity over time of an African-American person in Ypsilanti Township having to pay more than a white person. It may be because of these institutional inequalities that are broader and more complex and really need to be hammered down, so that we ensure that if people are coming through the justice system, that they're getting equivalent treatment and they're not being disproportionately overburdened, and their families are not being overburdened. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. And I think we have a question in the chat about, could you share some of your studies in the chat, Megan, when you get a chance? And we will be sharing out these resources with everyone afterward. So we'll compile a list and send out any resources you all share.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks for sharing that. And, you know, from just the research that I did during the course of trying to prepare for this, I mean, firstly, it seems like what I found is that African Americans, and I also send this, I think it's the Tax Policy Institute, cities that generate the most revenue from fines and fees have 5 times larger African American populations than other cities. And there was a study done, I don't know, Megan, if you're aware of this, of 50 cities that generate the most revenue from their fines and fees, and this is what they found. And, you know, they controlled for poverty. And they wanted to say maybe, you know, poverty correlates with fines and fees. But even in controlling for poverty, they still saw that even though, yes, some of these cities were only a little bit more poor than the national average, the biggest indicator that a government was going to levy excessive fines and fees was whether they had a large Black population. And cities that have a large white population simply do not issue as many fines and fees. And it made, you know, it brings me to a question that I wanted to pose to everyone, and I want us to think about throughout the course of this, is it seems like we're profiting off of a racist, inequitable system as a society. And what is that doing to all of us, right? Nicholas, is there anything that you want to share or jump in here?
Yeah, I think 2 things. I think that last question that you just asked was really profound. And there was in 2020, there was an organization, I want to say it was the Vera Institute, but I could be wrong. Victoria, you might know, but they came in and did a research on the county jails, specifically here in Wayne County. And
Yeah,
one
that
of the
was
stats
Vera.
that came out, yeah, it was Vera Institute, right? One of the stats that came out was the breakdown of the population, how Wayne County is overwhelmingly a white populated county. However, there are 3 county jails that are we call them like they're in Detroit, but they're located on like the outskirts of Detroit. And I think we have one that's actually in Detroit. And how it, like, when you look at the breakdown of these jails, they're overwhelmingly Black populations, Black people that are filling up the jail beds, right? And, you know, there's been this conversation or this narrative over years about, you know, the fines and fees and how police departments have to make a quota either at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year. For many of us, we don't know if this is true or not, right? But we see, you know, from the work that we do, we see how police officers kind of scout up and down 8 Mile, which is a road that separates Detroit City from the other suburban cities like Oak Park, Southfield, Royal Oak, Ferndale, so forth and so on. And then also up and down Telegraph, right? Like a lot of drivers are being targeted, and many people believe that they're being targeted because of their race, because they are Black. And the second thing I want to add on, and I think like Victoria, you were hitting on this when we talk about you know, fines and fees from people that are like directly impacted by the system. You know, I think it's one thing to talk about the stats and the figures, but also hearing the real stories that come from a lot of these injustices. I didn't put this in my introduction, but I am a formerly incarcerated person. I spent close to 10 years incarcerated here in Michigan Department of Corrections, and coming home in 2012, you know, many of our, well, not many, all of our parolees are hit with a parole fine, right? We have to literally pay a parole supervision fee. And what that means is I have to pay my parole officer to be supervised once I am done, you know, with my time of being incarcerated in prison. And if you do not make that payment, right? I had a parole officer, that's all she wanted was for me to make that payment. It wasn't about getting a job or securing housing or getting the resources. Every time I went to see my parole officer, which was twice a month, she wanted a money order. And there was a one moment, it was 90 days after I got out, I lost my first job at Family Dollar. And so what did that mean? I couldn't pay my parole officer anymore, right? And instead of like having this conversation of how to get the resources to better be productive and successful after incarceration, my parole officer said, hey, you have a week to find a job to bring me a check. And what did I do? I panicked. I went back into my criminalistic mindset. I started to sell weed so that I can pay my parole officer. I wasn't smoking. They gave me a lot of, you know, drug tests when I did get caught. And when they asked me that question, what made, after 90 days of being incarcerated, what made me pick up a bag of weed and start selling it? It's to pay my parole officer so that I would not go back to prison. But however, that violated my parole, and I ended up spending another 45 days back in confinement because of, you know, the way that the felony stigma works and the fines and fees that are placed on a person after incarceration.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Nicholas. And yeah, you know, you brought up something that actually I wanted to ask, and Nick also wanted to ask Ellie and Victoria, because we've all grown up hearing that police have a quota to meet by the end of the month, and like people get scared at the end of the month because you know, police officers are giving out more tickets. Number one, is that true? And yeah, I just want to know if it's true.
I guess I don't know that. I mean, to be clear, we're the prosecutors, so we don't run the police. I'll say we don't set any quotas, but we're not over the police. Anyway, so I don't know, Victoria, maybe you have more insight, but I
No, I wish I did. I think people assume that prosecutors and police are just all in one bubble, share the space and information. No, we're really like in 2 separate lanes. Do we work together? Do our prosecutions rely on their police investigations? Yeah, absolutely. And so we have to talk about that. But the way the sheriff's office or any city police department in our jurisdiction, township, any way they run their department with their policies, their rules, we are not privy to them in the prosecutor's office.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll also note that you know, there are various police departments that may have different policies. So you know, we don't know even for Washtenaw County, honestly. But if you're looking at statewide, I mean, there's hundreds upon hundreds of police jurisdictions. It may be that some do, it may be that some don't. But again, we just don't know. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that's helpful. And, you know, I know that both of you have received national recognition for some of the work that you're doing in Washtenaw County to combat fines and fees, which is amazing. Can you all talk a little bit about some of those efforts?
sure, I can start. And one
Ruby
thing
did.
to,
Oh, I was just gonna say, Ruby did send me a slide.
okay, we got a slide. Cool.
You got a slide.
Okay, so a few things. With respect to policy changes, this isn't a fine or a fee so much with bail. But let's explain what bail is. Cash bail is a system in which you're arrested for a crime, and before you know, your trial, you're told you can get out of jail, but only if you come up with a certain amount of money out of your bank account. Now, unlike, I want to clarify that unlike fines and fees, the idea behind bail is that you get the money back, right, if you show up for court and you know, you don't commit any new crimes. It's meant to be like an incentive for you to show up to court and stay on the straight and narrow. But functionally, what it does, of course, is it creates two different systems, one for people that have access to money and one for people that don't. Because if you are arrested, you know, for something that like I could afford, and your bail is set at $1,000, right? I could afford to pay that because I've got $1,000 in my bank account. But there's a lot of people that can't, and it doesn't make them any more dangerous if they don't have $1,000 in their bank account, right? By the same token, it means really rich people, even if they commit a crime that's like super dangerous, right? They can buy their way out of jail, right? A good example of this, this is from Connecticut, but there was this guy that kidnapped, murdered his wife, right? That's a very dangerous person. I think he was threatening some witnesses too. His bail was set at $6 million, right? Very few of us could afford to pay that. But this guy was a financier, right? He was like a hedge fund guy. He was out the next day for $6,000 or $6 million. Contrast that to, and this is an example from the ACLU lawsuit in Detroit. One of the plaintiffs there sat in jail for a week because he couldn't afford $200 bail, and the crime that he was in for was staying in the park after dark.
Wow.
So we got a system with bail in which wealthy murderers can buy their way out, and poor people that are in the park after dark, for lack of $200, sit in jail. Nobody would come up with this system today if we were making a criminal justice system from scratch. They just wouldn't. So what we do, we don't seek cash bail. We do try to, you know, I mean, there are cases where we seek to hold people in jail pending trial, but we try to use other tools, and it's based on public safety considerations, not whether a person has access to a lot of money in their bank account, or whether they don't. So we use our discretion to do that. It's up to ultimately a magistrate that sets bail. Hopefully we can continue to move forward with legislation that will build a much fairer system that treats people, you know, equally, not depending on the size of their bank account. But that's what we've done in the prosecutor's office. One of the things that we did that's on here that actually, frankly, you know, among the policies that we put in place hasn't gotten as much attention, but it deals with driver's license infractions, because for a very long time in Michigan, there was an absolutely vicious cycle in which people would get pulled over for speeding or, you know, some minor traffic offense. We are not talking about the kind of crime that keeps people up at night. We're talking about stuff that apparently my chief assistant here, she'd mentioned she's always getting parking tickets and speeding tickets. But most of us have done that, right? But if you're poor, often you can't afford to pay that speeding ticket that many other people may be able to pay, right? And then what happens if you don't pay your speeding ticket? After a certain point in time, your license becomes suspended, right? And if your license is suspended, you're driving with a suspended license. Again, we're not talking about people whose licenses were suspended for drug driving or safety issues, just that they didn't have the money to pay. then that's a crime. And then they can go to jail, right? And then if they don't have the money, they might be held in on cash bail, right? And this vicious cycle continues, and they might lose their job. They might lose their housing. They may not be able to provide for their family. And it all starts with just that speeding ticket, right? So we have a policy which says that we generally will not criminally charge for driving with a suspended license. Now, there's exceptions to that, right? If the reason your license was suspended was because you were driving drunk, right? You really shouldn't be behind the wheel of a car. You have a history of like reckless driving, something like that, like really dangerous stuff. Then we might consider bringing charges. But if it's poverty based, we're not bringing criminal charges. It doesn't mean we do nothing. Typically, what happens is we'll try to work together with the courts, with the would-be defendant, get your license restored, right? And luckily, our Secretary of State has been working on this issue. And that makes us all, frankly, safer, right? Because now you've got somebody that has been able to get their license restored, didn't have to face criminal consequences because of poverty, and you're going to be a safer driver, right? If you have that license. So that's one of the things that we did that directly related to these unpaid fines and fees and the criminalization of it. I mean, you know, the number of people that were criminalized for driving with a suspended license just because they didn't pay speeding tickets, really astronomical. Luckily, there was some legislative change on that soon or recently. As of I think a year ago, so we're making some headway on that. We don't charge for a bunch of crimes, which, you know, doesn't really directly impact have to do with fines and fees, but like we don't charge for stuff that like really doesn't impact public safety, you know. And the way that fits into fines and fees is because of those court costs, right? If we were charging a bunch of people for, you know, having too much marijuana, right? Marijuana is legal here now, but, you know, it can still be criminalized if you have too much of it, right? At the end of that, you're not going to go to jail for that. Even if we were to charge somebody for that, people aren't going to jail just for marijuana offenses, just solely for marijuana, really anywhere. But I'll tell you what they do. They have those fines and fees. They got to pay those court costs at the end of that case. So by not charging for a lot of the stuff that really doesn't have any real impact on public safety, we're able to avoid the levying of some of those fines and fees. Restitution. Restitution is something that's a little bit different than fines and fees. And Victoria, I'm going to let you talk about your baby. So you're the pre-plea diverted program, but talking briefly about restitution, right? Restitution is another mandatory cost that people going through the criminal system face. Restitution is not money that's really being kept by the court or by the government. It's restitution that needs to be made to the victim of the crime. So, you know, you imagine you break somebody's window, right? You got to pay for the cost of that window. You put somebody in the hospital, you owe them money for their injuries. And that's put in place so that victims can be made whole. What we were seeing in our juvenile system was, and this is an assistant prosecutor brought this up to us. We really love that, you know, our prosecutors are thinking about these new types of creative solutions to problems. But he said, look, I got kids in here who owe mandatory restitution. It's not something that can be waived, right? It has to be paid. And they've done everything else right on their probation, but probation gets held open and they keep tethered to the justice system when they're not able to pay restitution. It's only closed once you've fully paid off the victim, right? And that's sort of by law, right? And he's saying this is just so counterproductive, and it's really discouraging a lot of kids and families. And the longer they're tethered to the system, the more they feel hopeless. And by the way, the victim isn't getting the money either. And what does this all come back to? It comes back to, we're talking about, like, you know, in some cases, 13, 14-year-old kids, often from poorer families, right? They don't have a job. They're in school. Family may not be able to afford to pay for it. So we said, couldn't there be some way where we could raise some money and we could allow young people, juveniles, to earn restitution to pay their victim and then get off probation quicker? So Victoria and I said, that's a great idea. Let's go try to find some money for that. And we were able to raise the funds, and we run it through a nonprofit called the Washtenaw Justice Project. And this is a program that's now up and running. And for juveniles in the system, if they are assessed restitution, they can earn it. And the way they earn it is by doing what they're supposed to be doing anyway, abiding by the terms of probation, going to school, staying out of trouble. And every couple of weeks, they earn that money. The money goes right to the victim. It's paid to them. And it allows young people who are doing the right thing to get off probation sooner. It allows victims to be paid that money that they're owed and that they need to recover from whatever happened to them sooner. And it encourages young people it encourages young people to do the right thing, and they feel a sense of, I've earned this amount of money for abiding by the terms of my probation over the course of these 2 weeks or this month. So it's really one of these programs that's just a win-win-win, I think, for everybody, right? Victim gets the money faster. Juvenile and their family don't have to try to figure out ways to pay for it if they're already poor. And we get young people out of the system faster. So that's what we're doing with juvenile restitution. Again, restitution is somewhat separate from fines and fees because it does go to the victims, but it deals with a lot of the same issues when you just can't afford to pay. Victoria, I will let talk about her baby, which is the pre-diversion program, which she is rightfully very, very proud of.
So in my former life, I was a criminal defense attorney, and I had many clients that would want to take advantage of a diversion program that would require them to enter a guilty plea now, but then after 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, maybe even longer of a probationary period where they've done everything they're supposed to do, they don't get any new crimes, don't get arrested or have any, significant police interaction, then the plea that they entered is taken back, and the case is dismissed. Problem is, one, you oftentimes would not, as a defendant in the criminal legal system, have access to diversion programs if you had a significant criminal record. Two, if you, as a defendant, enter that guilty plea and you have some immigration issues that have not been resolved, just the mere fact that you entered a guilty plea, not convicted, because again, if you do all you're supposed to do, the case is dismissed and there's, not a conviction. But just entering that guilty plea automatically renders some folks deportable. And that means that they think that they're entering into a program that gives them a second shot, but then they find themselves in jeopardy of being deported and separated from their families and going to a place that they know no one and have never been outside of maybe being born there.
Right.
So we got together and we talked about, how about we fashion our diversion program different? How about we don't care about criminal history? Because if a person is stealing alcohol from the local 7-Eleven on State Street on U of M's campus, they're not a monster. They probably just got a problem. And that problem is not going to be resolved by us saying, nope, because you've been doing this before, you can't get help. You can't go into a diversion program. And we also did not want people to experience the collateral consequences of having to enter a temporary plea just to have it dismissed later. Temporary pleas not only have consequences as it relates to one's immigration status, but while that plea or that guilty plea is pending, your job can see it. Any future prospective employer can also see it. Housing opportunities are not available to you. For example, if you need to go into senior housing or low income housing, that may prevent you from doing so, having that temporary guilty plea that's on your record. And it's not always good enough that a defense attorney on letterhead writes a letter to explain that this comes off your record and they should act like it's not there, because it is. And so we didn't want people to have to deal with any of that. We also didn't want people to have to go on probation for, an unspecified period, 6, 9, 12 months or whatever, have to pay every month because there is a fee associated with probation. It's called a probation oversight fee. It's mandated by a statute that says it can be as low as $10 a month or as high as $50 a month. We didn't want that. We really just genuinely wanted to figure out what brought a person into the system, pair them with services in the community, with organizations and service providers that we knew of, and then send them on their merry way without entering a guilty plea, without having to officially go on probation, because there's a whole lot of strings that tied to probation that don't allow you to really mess up. And if you do, you've now messed up in a major way. We don't want any of that. So we launched a pilot program, and we launched it in our largest district court in the county, which is Ann Arbor, 15th District Court. 3 judges sit in that court. And we met with them and we said, look, we want to launch a program that will allow folks to get help they need for an issue that is identified with the help of your probation department. And let me back up. We talked to the judges, but that was only after the probation department in Ann Arbor just raised their hands and said, hey, we're willing to act as kind of case managers, if you will, in our probation department and happily oversee folks who don't need to be on probation, but still need some kind of assistance. We're happy to do that for you. Really? Okay. So we went to the judges and we talked to them about it after we built out this program with the probation department. The judges signed on to it. And so now every week in the Ann Arbor District Court, and we've now expanded it to courts throughout the county, slowly but surely, we've expanded to 2 other courts and are looking to expand to others. We look at the dockets every week ahead of time. We identify folks who, based on the offenses that they've been charged with, are eligible to participate in this program. We don't care about their criminal history in terms of them not being able to participate. We only care about it to kind of paint a picture of what's going on in their lives so that we can see what they may need. But we don't make that call because people know what they need better than we know what they need. And so they enter into a co-created treatment plan with their case manager in probation alongside their attorney. They work that plan for 6 months. Everything goes well. They get the help they need. 6 months later, they don't have a guilty plea that needs to be removed. They just have a pending pretrial that we say we're all done and we've dismissed this charge. They never had to plead guilty. They don't have to pay for it because we found the money in our budget to do so. And they're all the better for it. There are folks in this program who were doing things like, stealing because they were grieving a spouse and didn't quite understand that connection. Case manager and probation was helpful in getting them to understand that connection, getting them connected to therapeutic services. That person is now working a good job, making good money, and is now a person that I don't believe will ever see come back into this system again. That's the work of, for me, really helping people get to the root cause of their issue and addressing it with community intervention. Ellie called it my baby because I initially started building this program and, doing that work and labor of poring over dockets and reading, 12, 13, 14 cases that have been in our office for years to try to piece together what this person was dealing with. And we hired a person, her name is Alice, and she's absolutely phenomenal. She does all things diversion in our office, including some other diversion programs. And so when it was time for me to hand it over to her, I had a hard time with that. And Ellie said, Vic, you birth these babies so that you can give them to other people in this office to raise that we trust. You don't have time for that. You got to birth some more babies. So He didn't mean it.
I want to be clear, that was 100% not the phrasing that I that not in any way, shape, or form. So, the sentiment was the same. That's Victoria's gloss, which she did.
Create more programs, Vic. Create, build. That's essentially what he said. Yes, that was my editorializing there on top of that.
Well, that was a really, really helpful explanation of some of the initiatives you all are working on. And I was reading when researching for this about how just the use of specifically bail bonds has increased over time, and the amount has increased over time. So I think the efforts that you all are doing are really commendable. They're great. I did want to ask, what are some goals you all see? Like, what is something that you haven't been able to work on yet, but you think needs to be worked on, that it's an equity issue?
Something that our county is working on, and it's on this sheet, the Cities and Counties Fines and Fee Justice Center. We are a member of the latest cohort in that program. There are 6 counties across the country, and we are one of those 6 who have been awarded an opportunity to get some assistance in really doing a deep dive and attack on some of our fines and fees as it relates to the criminal legal system. We'll be looking to pull contracts that a lot of divisions within the county organization have with folks for like our tethers, the tablets that are at the jail. The sheriff's office has already significantly reduced the cost of phone calls, and the tablets are free. But the programs are not always free. So, you give folks these machines and say, hey, you have a machine that's nice and shiny and it's free. But if they really want to use it in a meaningful way, to develop themselves while inside, to have meaningful connections with folks outside, which we know research shows is the absolute best thing to do for folks who are incarcerated, they have to pay for that. And as one of you said, I think it was Megan, hit the nail on the head. The folks who are paying for those fines and fees associated with the criminal legal system are Black women, hands down. We pay for the calls that are coming in, collect. We pay for the JPays for the emails. We pay for the commissary and the commissary fees, because you put money on someone's books, they don't get everything you put on, fees come off of that. So that means that the Black woman who did that, be it the mama, the girlfriend, the wife, the sister, the auntie, the grandmama, godmother, first lady of the church, paying for that. And that is factual. We know that across the country. And Washtenaw County is no different. So that's what we are looking to do next, is just, again, go deeper and deeper until we can say that it is not costly to be poor and Black or a person of color in this county.
That's super helpful. Oh,
I also want to just add a couple more things on top of that really quick, which is we need more programs like the pre-plea diversion program that allow us to do something, right? Because it's not about doing nothing. It's not about just throwing our hands up and saying we're not going to address this, short of criminal legal intervention, right? And short of the collateral consequences that come along with that. Victoria gave some great stories, and there are many of them, around the people whose lives have been changed because they were able to avoid even that guilty plea and were able to access services and help before ever pleading guilty. But I also want to emphasize the numbers from that, which are that in that pre-plea diversion program, we've been running this for over a year now, right? And we got about 100 people that have gone through it. The success rate is 92%, which means that 92% of the people that go through that program don't get in trouble again, right? Do everything they were asked to do, and then their cases are fully and finally dismissed. Of the people that don't, the other 8%, right? Literally only 2 of them didn't abide by the program because they committed a new crime. Right, because they were accused of a new crime. So you're talking about a 98% non-recidivism rate for that program. to address the issues that people have, but short of criminal legal involvement that can cause these cascading consequences and make it harder for you to get a job, harder for you to get housing, harder for you to continue your education, and thus more likely to reoffend, right? So this stuff works, and we don't need the punitiveness of the criminal system in every single case. If we can really address issues shy of that, it doesn't just make us a fairer community, it makes us a safer community.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Ellie. And I want to now jump to, you know, there was a few times it was mentioned how Black women specifically bear the brunt of this, right? We know it's due to racism. Nick, I want you to tell your story a little bit about the creation of Michigan Liberation of the Michigan Black Mamas Bailout Fund. And specifically some of the stories too you shared with me previously about Black women that you've seen be victims of the criminal legal system.
Yeah, most definitely. Real quick, I just put in the chat a little bit about the Michigan Black Mamas Bailout. You're able to see some of our stats and some of the work that we've been able to do from there. In 2018, that's when we created Michigan Liberation, and the creation of this organization comes from, you know, being directly impacted, working with other base building organizers throughout Michigan, and just feeling that the work that we're doing around reform is not really working in the favor of like saving lives and protecting communities. And so we created this entity to really develop the formerly incarcerated leadership. There's a person out of New York named Glenn E. Martin. He is the founder of Just Leadership USA. He says those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and resources and power. And so when we talk about how to correct this system, I think the best people to really have a voice at the table, especially the decision-making table, are the formerly incarcerated folks and the people that are directly impacted by the legal system. And so with the creation of Michigan Liberation, we also gave birth, like Victoria like to say, we have multiple babies as well, right? And now some of our babies have babies, but we created what we call the Michigan Black Moms Bailout. I have a quote that I started saying that when we incarcerate a Black man, we disrupt the household. But when we incarcerate a Black woman, we disrupt the community, right? And even that incarceration does not mean that this Black woman have to be behind bars or in handcuffs or in confinement. That when one of us go to prison, ultimately, like we're bringing our family with us into that prison system. We're bringing our children, we're bringing our loved ones, we're bringing our community into that prison system. And so in 2018, we created the Black Moms Bailout. It was a way for us to, one, go into our community and start to advocate why cash bail is such a harm to the Black and brown community, especially those who are living and just surviving through poverty. And, you know, we wanted to kick off this campaign to really end cash bail in Michigan. And one of the crazy statistics that we was learning was that the fastest growing population in our county jails and also in our prison system today are women, Black women. And when you look at the system as it's designed now, it is not designed for women at all, right? In Michigan, we have a lot of prisons in Michigan, but we only have one prison that's designated to women. Over the last few decades, this prison has been overpopulated, has been overcrowded. There's a lot of harm that's going in and out of this prison. We've heard of, you know, women being sexually molested, even raped by prison guards in there. Diseases and viruses are easily being spread throughout this prison. And also when we look at the county jail, right, a lot of Black women are going into the county jail, not for like violence, right, but for these minor crimes. And we don't even want to call them crimes. As Ellie was saying, you know, people that have like driving on suspended license, for example. You know, we've come across mothers, literally moms that will go inside of the Walmarts and the Myers and are caught, you know, stealing baby formula, diapers. We had one mom who literally just stole a bra, right? And she's placed in jail for, you know, a $2,000 to $5,000 bond for something that costs literally about $20 and a couple cents plus tax. And, you know, with us starting this Black Moms Bailout, one of the cases that we really wanted to get on was there was a mom that was in Detroit. This was back in like 2018 or 2017. Her child ended up falling through the hole in the floor into the basement where there was sewage water, and this child ended up drowning and dying inside of the sewage water. And where many people would say that the mother was being neglectful, the mom was not being neglectful, right? The mother just having one opportunity in her life to go out and go get her hair done, her nails done. I think anybody should have that right to go and do. Just because you have a child does not mean that you do not have the luxuries of life to enjoy yourself. This mother did have a babysitter at the house while she went out and took care of herself. And however, this hole was covered up by the baby bed. And this mother had went constantly, to the landlord, to the homeowner to talk about this hole, and the landlord did absolutely nothing. The result, a child died. The prosecutor at that time decided to lock this mom up. The community felt that, the mother has already lost her child. What is it going to be for this mom to be behind bars? Like, how does this fix the harm that has been done? We wanted to go in and bail this mom out. Unfortunately, we couldn't. Right? We could not bail this mom out, but this is just a case of how poverty looks in many of our communities, that when we're poor, when we're struggling and surviving through poverty, the number one thing that we're often given is criminalization, right? We also see this with folks that are dealing and struggling and living and surviving through mental health and mental illness. One of the things, we're being criminalized. We just had an episode here in Detroit where a young man was murdered by the police because of a mental health crisis that he was going through. And so with the Black Moms Bailout, in 2019, we was able to raise a little over $30,000 in 3 different counties: Wayne, Oakland, Kalamazoo County. We ended up bailing out roughly about 25 Black moms and bringing them home, connecting them to the resources that they needed to be successful and productive after the court process, but also connecting them to the resources while they're going through the court process. And, ironically, right, people, they will talk down, why are you bailing these criminals out of jail? All they're going to do is go right back. We're not a bail bonds people, so we're not like, oh, we're going to bail you out, you have to sign over your house or your car. No, we just want to help. That's it, right? And for us, over the last few years, like, we have a huge success rate. I want to say about 98% of the folks that we've been able to bail out have not went back to jail. They have went to court. They had their cases adjudicated. That money has been able to return back to the community, which is Michigan Liberation and the Black Moms Bailout. And, there was when the pandemic kicked off, we were running across instances where people were being locked away for as low as like $1, right? It's all in our report. It's all in that link that I just shared. And that's not over exaggeration. Our prosecutor at the time felt that, the safety of the community only cost $1, $20, $5, however. And so we had an opportunity to go in and start to bail, more and more people out. And there was folks, Black moms, right, with children that were sitting in jail for like 5 days. They lost their job. They lost benefits. They had their cars impounded. They had to worry about who were the family members that were taking care of their children. They had to worry about if their children were making it to school for those 5 days. So there's so much that has been impacted with these folks, once they go into this legal system, whether if it's for 1 day, if it's for 10 years, but for the fact of the Michigan Black Mamas Bailout, just finding people that was in there for less than a week and how much harm this was causing, not just these families and these moms, but it was causing the community as well, right? And so today we still have the Michigan Black Moms Bailout. It's active, it is running. We've been able to raise more money. And so we expanded our program, not just to bail out Black moms, but now we're taking a look at the whole system. Who can we actually bail out, and how can we connect them to the resources so that they can stay out? And then on the flip side, again, like in cash bail, I give a round of applause to what's happening in in Washtenaw County, but these type of practices need to spread all across Michigan. And this ideal of ending cash bail is not something new. It's not something that I created or Victoria Ellie created or progressive prosecutors. This is like, it's across the country. There have literally been cities and towns and states that have ended their cash bail and have crushed that narrative that if there is no cash bail, violence will rise up. That's not true, right? Cash bail actually creates more violence in our community. We have not seen from the folks that we have bailed out, and some of the people we have bailed out, they do have violent cases. They did not resort back to violence. This idea that when we open that lane up for folks that have violent, that has violent convictions, myself, I went to prison for armed robbery. I didn't come out thinking about robbing somebody else, right? But it's that exposure to community organizing is that exposure to the School of Social Work, right? More education that ultimately kept myself and many others that have tread that path away from criminalization. So, I think that when we're working with these individuals in our communities, it comes across fines and fees or keeping people out of the jail system. We have to make sure that we're exposing them to the right resources so that they can be productive, they can be successful, and step away from a life of criminalization, and also step away from how society will criminalize us as well.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing all of that. And I like how you touched on how, in the absence of like social safety nets, like our government doesn't do a good job of helping people who are poor. We over police Black communities. That's something else that the study that I shared showed, that the reason why cities that have high populations of Black people generate more fines and fees is because they're more highly policed. I guess I want to ask you, what are some of the goals that Black Mamas Bailout, that Michigan Liberation has around this cause? Like, what do you hope to achieve?
Yeah, so one, I want everybody to know, Michigan Liberation, we do 100% of our work through a lens of abolition. And that's not a knock to anybody that's doing reform work. But when we look at a lot of these draconian policies that have been in place for decades, right, it just needs to go. Ultimately, we want to see a world that is absent of criminal justice systems and police. That does not mean that we want to see anarchy and not hold people accountable. The ways that we are holding folks accountable right now are draconic. We are locking people away for what we say rehabilitation, which comes in a form of harm once you are incarcerated. And I give a small example. If you get pulled over, your license suspended, you don't have your car registered, there's like a small chance that you might go to jail. But however, you will be treated the same way as somebody that would do a mass shooting, right? You will be treated as that criminal. Even in the prison system, we've heard these stories over the years. The system has lost the funding to have educational, classes, to have the colleges in there, to have the self-help programs in there. And so now we're just locking people up. We're putting them behind bars with the hope that you will come out as a sane person, right? And so some of the, the goals with the Michigan Black Moms Bailout is simple. We want to end cash bail. Is no ifs, ands, or buts. It's not for nonviolence or violence across the board. Let's end cash bail. A more hopeful vision for Michigan Black Moms Bailout and centered around women. We want to close down Huron Valley. Like, hear me and get it straight. When we look at the conditions of Huron Valley, when we talk to the moms and the women that's in there, the abuse, the trauma, and the harm that goes on inside of there, and the trauma and harm that many of these women were criminalized for, there's no need to have them incarcerated, right? The link that I shared in I think it was 2020, we interviewed a number of Black women that were formerly incarcerated at Huron Valley. A number of these women were juvenile lifers, women that, were locked up at the ages of 15, 16, 17, and were, they were ultimately sentenced without the possibility of parole. And yes, like, they had an opportunity to come out, had an opportunity, to join many organizations and become advocates in the community. We don't see none of these women, wanting to commit murder again, wanting to harm children, or wanting to harm the community, but rather being the nurturers that they are and reaching back to other women that are still incarcerated in there. But in that link, you will hear, you will read, you will see the stories before they was locked up, while they were locked up, and even the harm that our society continues to put on Black women as they come out of the system. It's one thing to be a Black man and come out of the system and have to live through that stigma, but that stigma is on steroids for Black women, right? And it's their stories that are not often heard. We don't often hear their stories. And so with the Black Moms Bailout, we want to create that platform so that all the women that's coming out of these incarcerational institutions are being heard, and the society can know the truth of what is happening, in our legal system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nicholas. I think you have a question in the chat, and then I want to turn it over to Megan for a moment. So Nasreen, would you like to unmute yourself? And if not,
yes.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I posted my question. Nicholas, you mentioned there was the Black Mamas bailout, the people that you bailed out, there was a 98% of success. I wanted to know, that is based on what span of time is that study is based on?
Yeah, so that's a real good question, right? We started this program in 2018, and roughly it would take about 2 years for a person's case to be fully adjudicated. Some of the cases we've seen come and go for the most part because of the pandemic and many other factors in our society. We've been holding on to folks. We're working with folks in their cases for at least 1.5 years up to 2 years. Also, when we work with these individuals and bailing them out, I'm an organizer, and I love to grow the base, right? And I am organizing formerly incarcerated folks, directly impacted folks. And so once we bail these people out, the ideal is to bring them closer to the organization. One, want to develop their leadership so that they can be the powerful people that they need to be. But two, to also measure how, when we say we're building folks out, and the resources that we're pouring behind them, what that would look like for them as they're navigating from day to day after, being in jail or having to pay their bail. So I would say 1.5 years to 2 years as we're working with folks, closing out their cases. We try to collect as much data as we possibly can on, each individual as they're going through their case, so that we can create these liberation freedom plans for, not just like funders, but for our communities and our society to see as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. And thanks for the question, Nasreen. So Megan, I wanted to turn it over to you and have us back up a little bit, because I don't think we've clearly talked about what are the consequences to people who go through the system, right? Let me actually share your slide. If you want to go ahead and maybe, talk about voting and just what you've seen in your research about how it impacts people.
Sure, thanks, Aisha. There are spiral effects to non-payment. Non-payment of a speeding ticket in some jurisdictions can result in a bench warrant, an actual arrest warrant. And for people who are vulnerable, for example, someone who's facing housing insecurity or domestic violence and they frequently relocate, they may not have updated their address. And so then the government who wants the money for the ticket sends their appearance notice, so a letter saying you have to come to court to explain why you haven't paid. They send it to an old address. The person doesn't get it. Then they send a warrant, an arrest warrant to the address. And that person now is wanted. And that person doesn't necessarily know that they're wanted. And this all stems from a traffic ticket. And I may be simplifying the process, and Victoria and Ellie, feel free to correct me if any of this sounds not 100% accurate from the criminal law perspective, because I am a social scientist. But my understanding is it can be as simple as owing a traffic ticket or owing some fines and fees, whether it's your probation supervision fees. It can really spiral into something much more debilitating that can interact with your housing situation and any vulnerabilities that you may have. So I saw someone in the chat had mentioned something about the difficulty for people who have disabilities and paying fines and fees and keeping up. One thing we see is, you know, if you have to come into court and advocate for yourself and you have mobility issues and you have a difficult time getting into the courthouse. I mean, there's so many reasons why people get caught in the system who are vulnerable and end up with these really adverse outcomes. And so even just without any barrier to coming to work, for someone who works an hourly wage, let's say you're working at McDonald's, you don't necessarily have paid time off. So if you have to go in for a court date, maybe the hearing's at 9 a.m., they may not call your case till 1 p.m. So now you've lost your wages from work. You may have had to have gotten a childcare provider, paid that person. And who knows what the outcome is? Maybe you still owe these fines and fees. And so there's so many factors here, and institutional disparities and discrimination that can really result in these negative outcomes. And something that really there's not a lot talked about, but I did a lot of previous work on credit markets and access to housing. People don't think about it frequently, but fines and fees owed to the government often show up on your credit report. And so if you owe arrears to child support, that's on your credit report. And in Michigan, child support arrears, meaning overdue money that you owe, I think it's $5,000. If you owe $5,000, it goes to a felony warrant. That's a pretty low threshold. So let's say you have 2 kids and you pay $1,000 a month, and you've been struggling with drug addiction and you haven't paid on time. And so you owe $5,000, maybe after 6 months. That's not a very long amount of time. You now have a felony criminal warrant. And so this is a really big issue for a lot of people. We see in Washtenaw County, I don't believe that front of the court picks up people on warrants. They don't go after people to their homes for child support warrants, at least according to the former front of the court director who I'm familiar with. But, you know, the complication of having these fines and fees on your credit report, they simply put someone who's already in a marginalized position in a more marginalized position. And so if you're going and you're competing, let's say, to get an apartment in a tight market like Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and there's 10 people who put an application in, if your credit check comes back and says that you owe the government all this money, do you think you're going to get that lease? Probably not, right? It could be as simple as owing some money and it gets on your credit report. It also can look really adversely negative for an employer, a prospective employer who's going to run a background check. And now anybody can run a background check for anyone. You don't have to necessarily be a business owner. And so even small landlords who traditionally were maybe more forgiving, maybe having someone fill out a background screen because it's so easy to do online now. And so we see people who are already struggling with these structural barriers just to get jobs, just to get housing, just to get transportation, put in a situation simply because they were in poverty or lower income. And these issues can be faced not just by people who have low or no income, but maybe even like a lower middle income. So let's say you make $35,000 or $40,000. If you all of a sudden owe probation or parole over $1,000, that might be debilitating for someone in the Ann Arbor area where the cost of living is very, very high. And so if you have to come up with this money, and it's often, you know, a lump sum, you have to pay this to get off of probation, or you're still going to remain under government supervision, which government supervision in its own right entails often periodic fees, whether it's a monthly probation oversight fee that Victoria mentioned. Maybe it includes drug testing, which is very, very expensive over time, alcohol testing, and other sorts of government surveillance. And so essentially not being able to pay increases the government's ability to have all these surveillance mechanisms and other costs that go along with them. So one of these, when I say surveillance, I mean things like wearing a GPS tether, or having to what's called drop, where you have to leave a urine sample or you have to take some sort of a drug test, a swab in your mouth. And so owing even a small amount of money can really create kind of chaos in people's lives and result in this cyclical impoverishment where people who already were marginalized are really finding it difficult to obtain and maintain employment and housing. And what happens to people when they don't have housing and they don't have steady employment? They sometimes fall into crime, and it's pretty obvious to like link those things together once you start really thinking about it, and the way in which this all sort of collides into this tornado of, you know, poverty being the actual crime. Even if poverty is not a crime, it's being treated in a criminal manner in our system because of these sort of injustices and just an institution that's somewhat broken. So
yeah. Thank you, Megan, for that. It's almost like, you know, debtors' prisons don't exist anymore based on the Constitution, but they do, right? It's like we create these invisible cages on people once they get out of jail, and people can lose their right to vote. I think it's Georgia that takes away your right to vote if you don't pay your court fees. So we have some really great examples, and someone who has written in the chat, Mary, would you like to unmute yourself and just share a little bit about your story? If not, that's okay too. But
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a few words about the situation with women, because the abuse and the medical neglect was so severe for many of us. By the time we came home, we were in really bad shape, to the point where it was real difficult to pay fines and fees and parole costs. One of my dear friends, Leslie, was paroled, and we had to take her straight to the emergency room immediately that same day. She had had pneumonia for over 2 months. So I don't think there's a real understanding of the burden of this when you've already been through hell and back, and you've relied on your own resources to get home. And when you've been locked up that long, it takes every single thing that you have to be able to make it to the finish line. But you don't realize what's on the other side of that door. And you don't realize what a burden it's going to be to try to come up with the money so that you can discharge, because you're expected, just like Nicholas said, you're expected to give them money every time you go. And so now, even now, I have the effects of being disabled from, you know, basically busting my butt when I came home trying to make sure that I could do everything that I was supposed to do and be able to pay those fees. My family said, you know, those are your fees, you're going to pay them. So I didn't have a problem with that, but I was making $6 an hour working at Myers, you know, hauling unbelievable amounts of stock to the floor and back and forth, back and forth. So many of the women of my generation have passed away, and they've died from the effects of cancer, strokes, toxic water, asbestos in the ceiling at places like Florence Crane Women's Facility when it was open. Even now I have, when you x-ray my lungs, they have asbestos. So for younger people that have more years ahead of them that may be able to wrestle with these issues a little more capably than women of my age, you know, it's understood that there may be a way to help alleviate some of the payment, some of the suffering. But for those of us that have already lived that whole life of suffering and now are strapped with exorbitant fees, I think it's really important that people understand the costs of supervision can't be discharged. And if you can't pay them, there's some parole officers that will send them to Treasury, and then Treasury puts a lien on your income tax check that you get back. So the government finds a way to get that money one way or the other. And so that the damage to your pocketbook and to you, this can go on forever, you know, until that bill is paid.
Mary, thank you for sharing. And, you know, I'm so sorry that you have been a victim of these inequitable systems. I mean, it makes this conversation even more important. And it turns me to, like, you know, kind of my closing question, which is, what is the role of social workers in all this? How can we get involved in making a change? Nicholas, do you want to jump in a little bit with your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I had to gather myself from just hearing that from Mary. And Thank you for sharing that, and yeah, just sharing your story. I know that's tough. I think, you know, our role as social workers, you know, is one, not to look at this issue as just being, you know, an issue that's singled out from many other issues. This is so interconnected with so many other things, right? I share this story about, you know, the making of license plates. Your license plate is made in prison, right? If you live in Michigan, you pay a couple $100 for that license plate. I need to go to mine. It's made in prison. It is made by a incarcerated person that is making less than $1.50 a day, right? And there's so many. We can do like the, you know, look at the numbers and the stats, but to hear these stories, as social workers, it's important. Like, we have to advocate for these folks. 95% of the people that are incarcerated here in Michigan will return back to our communities at some point. There's only a small portion that are doing life. And if we look at that 95% and we're looking at our communities, lack of housing, lack of employment, lack of resources, like, that's our duty as social workers, is to ensure that these resources are there for folks that are at an advantage, that are directly impacted by these systems. And so, you know, whether if you're specializing in community change, you know, if it's government and policy, if it's IP, like, we can go through all of the pathways. It is so important, like, each one of us that is in these different pathways, look at this draconic system and start to utilize our voices, educate folks. We need to train folks, and ultimately we need to change policies. We need to change policies across this entire board, especially around these fines and fees, because this is another way of incarcerating people. It's that invisible barrier of incarceration that we're placing out into our communities now. We no longer have to put a person in prison behind bars, but we can incarcerate them right there in their house, right there in their community, off of just fines and fees. That tether system that was spoken of earlier, I'm gonna be quiet. That tether system is extremely expensive. To do a drug test is extremely expensive. And this is just another tactic that this society, this system has come up with to incarcerate Black and brown poor people, without even having to put them into a physical building. So I would encourage social workers not to take this lightly, and look at how this is, $20, and just, you know, seeing how this is interconnected with, if you're working with geriatric folks, how is the system impacting geriatric folks? If you're working with young folks, how is the system impacting young folks? And come to the table as decision makers with that community and making the right decisions on the policies that we want to implement and the policies we want to see taken away.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And thank you to everyone and all the panelists. Y'all are doing amazing work and it's necessary. And if there's any also ways that we can all get involved, please let us know. Nicholas, if you want to share some initiatives going on that students can get involved, or Ellie and Victoria or Megan, please go ahead.
So I put in the chat the Michigan Liberation website. Victoria, I love doing prosecutor work. So I have a very special connection to both of our prosecutors here, and to just hear the report out. This is my first time like hearing from them in a couple of years on just the work that's happening. But yeah, with Michigan Liberation, we're running a campaign right now to end cash bail. We're also running a campaign to decriminalize substance use, mental health, and also sex work. We just took our entire staff to Puerto Rico for the 4-day harm reduction conference, and to gather that information and come back into our communities and start to change the paradigm of harm reduction through our bailouts. We also do brake light clinics, where we just like occupy a space and start to fix people brake lights so that they won't come in contact with the police. We also have a campaign right now that is centered around sentencing. So we're looking at truth in sentencing, which is a draconian policy that requires an incarcerated person to do more than 100% of their time incarcerated, where surrounding states have taken away truth in sentencing and gave incentives. If you do, so many educational programs, or if you just, stay on a good track, you can have time knocked off of your sentence. And that's not something new. Our county jails does it. Our federal prison system does it. Why can't we do the same thing? And yeah, ultimately, if you are a person or know of a person that is formerly incarcerated or just impacted by the legal system, we do these, what we call leadership development trainings. Ultimately, we want folks to feel as powerful as they possibly can be. Whether if that means you want to go run for, state rep or run for prosecutor, or if you just feel like the felony stigma is really digging you into the ground and you don't have a voice at all, we want to invest into you so that you can have that voice, and that you will, that you can be heard. If you see me on campus, hey, holla at me. But other than that, look us up, Michigan Liberation, the Michigan Black Mamas Bailout. We do respond back to our email. So if you see that info link on there, just know that if you send us some words, less than 24 hours, one of our folks will get back with you. And you can follow us all on every social media platform, Michigan Liberation, Michigan Black Mamas Bailout.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And thank you, everyone. We're going to have to wrap up now. There's a lot of information on this topic, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email as well. But thank you all for joining. If the students of the Engaged Community class could please stay on.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye. Go do good work.
You too. Also, we didn't get a chance to just say we have an upcoming session in December on the 1st, trauma-informed interpersonal practice with marginalized clients. And we'll send this information out too. Thanks, everyone.